Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're gonna dive into the world of fluorochemicals. It's a market that's honestly kind of hidden in plain sight.
Yeah,
They're all around us, but most people don't know a ton about them.
yeah, that's true.
And we're going to be looking at this through the lens of the Global Fluorochemical Market Report 2025. As always, our goal here is to pull out the important stuff. Cut through all the jargon, all the data, and just give you the big picture.
Exactly. I mean, we want to answer some pretty basic but important questions here.
Yeah.
How big is this market now? How much bigger is it going to get? And what's making it grow?
And when we say important, we mean it. I mean, these things, these chemicals, they're in everything. Keeping your fridge cold,
Hmm.
uh, powering the phone or the computer you're listening to this on, even the semiconductors that are in pretty much every piece of electronics these days.
Right. I mean, if you're using something electronic, chances are there are fluorochemicals in there somewhere.
So let's jump into it. What does this report tell us about the current state of the market?
Well, right off the bat, it gives us a pretty impressive number. It estimates that in 2025, the global fluorochemicals market is going to be worth something like $28.57 billion.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a lot of money for something that most people have never even heard of.
Almost $29 billion. That's huge. So where does the report say this is all going?
Well, the projections are pretty optimistic. They're saying that by 2033, the market should reach $41.57 billion.
Okay.
So, pretty significant jump. And that's based on a compound annual growth rate, a CAGR, of about 4.8% from 2025 to 2033. So, not a massive jump every year, but consistent. And over time, that adds up.
Right, that compounding growth is a powerful thing. And it's interesting that they're using data from 2024 as their base here, and even looking back at trends going back to 2021 to make these predictions. So they're really trying to get a complete picture. Okay, let's get a little more specific here. Geographically, where is this market concentrated? I've heard that the Asia Pacific region is a major player.
Yeah, it is. Right now, APAC has the lion's share of the market, about 44%. And that translates to something like $12.57 billion in 2025. But what's really interesting is that it's not just big, it's also growing really
Right,
fast.
it's got the fastest projected growth, doesn't it?
Yeah, they're projecting a CAGR of 6.4% between 2025 and 2033. That's pretty significant. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that APAC is really becoming a global manufacturing powerhouse, especially for things like electronics and cars. So you have growing domestic demand in places like China and India, but they're also exporting a lot of these goods to the rest of the world.
Right, it's not just about where the final products are being sold, it's about where they're being made.
Yeah.
And when you look at the specific numbers for
Yeah.
APAC, China's really leading the way.
Yeah, definitely. They're looking at a market size of about $5.28 billion in 2025 and a healthy CGR of 5.9%. But you know what's really interesting is that the real standout in the region in terms of growth is actually India. Yeah, they're starting from a smaller base, obviously, $1.26 billion in 2025. But their projected CAGR is a whopping 8.3%. That's the highest growth rate for any country mentioned in the report.
Wow, that's impressive. So what else is going on in APAC? What are some of the other countries that are contributing to this growth?
Well, you've got Japan, of course, which is always a major player in electronics. They're at about $1.73 billion with a OGIR of 4.9%. And South Korea is right up there, too. They're at 1.51 billion with a CIR of 5.5%. And then you've got places like Taiwan, Singapore, and like Southeast Asia as a whole, Australia, all making significant contributions. And even within those regions, you see some interesting variations. For instance, Singapore's got a really strong CAGR of 6.7%. And Southeast Asia as a whole is looking at a robust 7.2% growth.
Okay, so it's a very dynamic and very diverse region. Lots of different countries contributing to this overall growth story. Now, shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about North America. They're the second largest market right here.
Yeah, that's right. They're holding on to a little over 25% of the global market share, and they're sitting at about $7.14 billion in 2025. But their projected growth is a bit slower than APAC, about 3% CAGR.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. They're starting from a more mature market position. So are there any specific countries to highlight in North America?
Well, the U.S. is obviously the big dog there, $5.64 billion in 2025, with a CAGR of 2.8%. Canada's got a slightly faster growth rate at 3.8%, and Mexico's right around there, too, at 3.5%.
Okay, and what's the picture like in Europe?
Europe's holding steady at a little over 21% of the global market share, and they're looking at about $6 billion in 2025. Their projected growth is pretty moderate at 3.2% CAGR. Germany and the UK are the big players there. Germany is at 1.19 billion with a CAGR of 3.4%, and the UK is a little higher at 4% CAGR with a market size of 1.01 billion. Russia and the rest of Europe are growing a bit slower.
Okay, so still significant, but not quite the same pace as APAC or even North America. And what about the rest of the world?
Well, South America's got a market share of over 3.8%. It's valued at about $1.9 billion in 2025, and it's growing at a pretty decent clip, 5.1% CAGR. Most of that's coming from Brazil and Argentina. Then you've got the Middle East. They're sitting at around 4% market share with a size of $1.4 billion in 2025, and they're growing at 5.3% CAGR. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are the main drivers there. And then finally, you've got Africa. They've got the smallest market share at about 2.2%, a size of $0.63 billion in 2025, but they're still growing at a respectable 4.5% CAGR. And the main market to watch there is South Africa. You mentioned South Africa is a key market. Are there any specific sectors within the South African mining or water treatment industries that are particularly driving this fluorochemical demand? In South Africa, the mining sector utilizes fluorochemicals as flotation agents to help separate valuable minerals from ore. Additionally, the increasing need for clean water in the region is driving the adoption of fluorochemical-based membranes in water treatment facilities.
Okay, so a lot of different regions and different stages of development, but all contributing to this global market. Now let's dive a little deeper into the types of fluorochemical products that are out there. What are the main categories?
Well, the report breaks it down into three main categories. You've got fluorocarbons, fluoropolymers, and then a category for fluoroelastomers and other more niche products. Interestingly, the report says that fluorocarbons are expected to remain the biggest category for the time being. They're used extensively as refrigerants in air conditioning systems and in various industrial processes. And this is despite the fact that there are some environmental concerns about certain types of fluorocarbons.
Right, so it's kind of interesting that they're still dominating the market, even with those concerns. I mean, that seems kind of contradictory,
Yes.
doesn't it? Does the report say anything about how long that dominance is expected to last, given all the push for greener alternatives? Or are there certain applications where fluorocarbons are just irreplaceable right now?
Yeah, it's definitely a tension point. The report suggests that while the overall market share of fluorocarbons might decline in the long run as regulations tighten and alternatives become more widely available, they're probably going to remain a major part of the market for the foreseeable future, especially when it comes to existing equipment and certain industrial uses where there just aren't any viable alternatives yet, either from a cost perspective or a technical perspective.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned fluoropolymers is another big category. What's the story there?
Yeah, fluoropolymers are actually the fastest growing segment, and that's because they're being used more and more in a bunch of industries that are themselves growing really fast. Things like automotive electronics, aerospace, even medical applications. And the reason for that is that fluoropolymers have some really unique properties. They're extremely resistant to chemicals, they're very stable at high temperatures, and they have very low friction. So when you think about things like making cars lighter and more fuel efficient or increasing the range of electric vehicles, fluoropolymers are playing a key role.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we hear all the time about the need for lighter and stronger materials, and it sounds like fluoropolymers are a big part of that. Now let's look at how these fluorochemicals are actually being used. What are the main applications?
Well, according to the report, the biggest application by far is refrigerants. And that's because fluorocarbon-based refrigerants are used in pretty much every HVAC system, every fridge, every freezer, every car AC unit in the world. But there is a big shift happening towards refrigerants with a lower global warming potential, things like HFOs or even natural refrigerants. And that's because of increasing environmental regulations and a growing concern about climate change.
Right, that move towards greener refrigerants is a big trend in itself. What about other applications? What are some of the other areas where fluorochemicals are really making a difference?
Well, the electricals and electronics segment is growing really rapidly. And that's because fluoropolymers are being used more and more in things like semiconductor manufacturing, the insulation for wires and cables, and protective coatings for electronic components. And this is all driven by some major trends in the tech world, like the rollout of 5G networks, the growth of the electric vehicle market, and the increasing demand for high performance computing.
Okay, so refrigerants and electronics are the big ones. Are there any other notable applications worth mentioning?
Yeah, the report mentions aluminum production and the making of plastic foams as a couple of other important areas, although they're not growing quite as fast as refrigerants and electronics.
Mm.
And we're also seeing increasing use of fluorinated compounds in pharmaceuticals, so that's something to keep an eye on.
Okay, so we've got a good overview of the market, the key players, the products, and the applications. Now let's talk about what's driving all this growth. What are the underlying forces that are pushing this market forward?
Well, the report identifies a few key drivers. First, as we've already talked about, the growing demand for fluoropolymers in the automotive and electronics sectors is a major factor. These industries are always looking for ways to improve performance and reduce weight, and fluoropolymers often fit the bill.
Right, we definitely talked about that when we were looking at the applications. What else is contributing to the market's expansion?
Well, another big driver is the increasing global demand for cooling solutions. As the world gets hotter and more urbanized, the need for air conditioning and refrigeration is only going to increase. And even with the shift towards more environmentally friendly refrigerants, the underlying demand for these types of chemicals is still there.
Makes sense. And what's the third big driver that the report highlights?
The growing use of fluorinated compounds in the pharmaceutical industry is also contributing to the market's growth, although it's not as big a factor as the demand from automotive and electronics.
Okay, so it's a combination of those three factors. Now, what about the flip side? Are there any headwinds? What are the things that could potentially slow down this growth?
Yeah, there are a couple of key restraints to consider. First off, fluorochemicals are generally pretty expensive to produce, and that can be a barrier in some applications or in certain parts of the world where price is a major concern. If someone can come up with a cheaper alternative that performs just as well, that could definitely put a damper on growth.
That's true. I mean, if there's a more economical option, it's always going to be attractive. What's the other major restraint?
The other big factor is the increasing availability of substitutes and the growing preference for greener alternatives. As people become more aware of the environmental impact of certain fluorochemicals and as regulations get tighter, there's more pressure to switch to more sustainable options.
Right, so the cost and the environmental impact are the two big challenges. Now, looking ahead, what are some of the key trends that the report identifies? What are the things that are going to shape the future of this market?
Well, one really interesting trend is the growing use of fluorochemicals in the manufacturing of lithium-ion batteries. They're being used in various parts of the battery, like the separators, coatings, and electrolytes. And with the electric vehicle market booming and the demand for energy storage solutions increasing, this trend is only going to accelerate.
Right, that's a pretty direct link. More EVs means more demand for fluorochemicals.
Yeah.
What other trends does the report highlight?
Another trend is the increasing use of fluorochemicals in water treatment and industrial cleaning. They're being used to make special membranes for water purification and in coatings that are super resistant to corrosion.
Okay, so the applications are expanding beyond the traditional areas. Now let's talk about the competitive landscape. Who are the big players in this industry?
The report describes the market as very competitive with both global companies and regional specialists. Some of the key players that are mentioned include 3M DuPont Daikin Industries, Solvay Honeywell International Arkema, and a company called Gujarat Fluorochemicals Limited, which is often referred to as GFL.
Yeah, those are some big names in the chemical industry. It sounds like a pretty concentrated market at the top. Does the report mention any recent activity in terms of mergers, acquisitions, or strategic partnerships?
Yeah, it does actually. It mentions that back in June of 2023, Arkema acquired a controlling interest in a Brazilian company called PM, which specializes in adhesives and sealants.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and they're seeing this as a way to strengthen their position in the adhesives market and expand their footprint in Latin America. And it aligns with their overall strategy of focusing on sustainable and innovative solutions.
Right, so it's all about strategic growth and expanding into new markets. What about GFL? You mentioned them earlier. Are they doing anything noteworthy?
Yeah, back in September of 2022, GFL announced that they were going to invest a pretty substantial amount of money, about 2,500 crore Indian rupees over the next couple of years to expand their production of fluoropolymers and battery chemicals. And they're specifically focusing on increasing their capacity for high-performance fluoropolymers like FKM, PVDF, and PFA. And that's because they see a lot of growth potential in areas like EV batteries, semiconductor manufacturing, and renewable energy.
That's a pretty big investment. It really shows how bullish they are on the future of this market. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's circle back to those regional dynamics for a minute. The report gives some specific examples of what's driving growth in different parts of the world,
Mm.
starting with North America. What are some of the key factors there?
Well, as we talked about earlier, there's a big push towards more environmentally friendly refrigerants in North America, and that's being driven by regulations like the AIM Act in the US and the Global Kigali Amendment. So we're seeing faster adoption of things like HFOs and natural refrigerants, and there's a lot of innovation happening around energy efficient cooling technologies as well.
And what about Europe? What's the main story there?
In Europe, the big driver is the shift towards electric vehicles. They've got strict emissions regulations, and a lot of government incentives are in place to encourage people to buy EVs. So there's a huge demand for fluoropolymers that are used in the production of EV batteries, specifically in things like separators, coatings, and electrolytes.
Okay, and what about Asia Pacific? What's fueling their growth?
Asia Pacific is already the world leader in semiconductor and electronics manufacturing, and that's driving a huge demand for high-performance fluoropolymers. They're used in everything from smartphones to 5G infrastructure to Internet of Things devices to high-performance computing systems. And then there's all the investment that's going into building new semiconductor foundries and AI-powered data centers.
So they're really at the forefront of the technology boom. What about South America? What's happening there?
South America is experiencing rapid industrialization and urbanization, and that's driving demand in sectors like construction, automotive manufacturing, and general manufacturing. So they need more and more fluorochemicals for things like protective coatings, insulation materials, and waterproofing solutions.
Makes sense. And what about the Middle East?
Well, the Middle East is a global hub for oil and gas and petrochemicals. And they use a lot of fluorochemicals because they're so resistant to harsh conditions. So you see them in things like pipeline coatings, gaskets, and seals. And then there's also a lot of investment happening in desalination technologies because water scarcity is a big issue in the region.
Right. And finally, what about Africa? What are the key factors there?
In Africa, the main drivers are mining and water treatment. Fluorochemicals are used in mining to help separate minerals from ore. And they're also used in corrosion-resistant equipment, which is essential in those harsh mining environments. And on the water treatment side, there's a growing need for clean water across the continent. So they're using more and more fluorochemical-based membranes and filtration systems.
Okay, so it's a really diverse global landscape. Lots of different factors driving growth in different regions. So to wrap up here, what are the key takeaways from this report? What are the big things that people should remember?
Well, the big picture is that the global fluorochemicals market is a major force in the world economy. It's already worth over $28 billion, and it's projected to grow to over $41 billion by 2033.
Yeah, those are some big numbers.
And this growth is being driven by a wide range of applications in industries that are essential to modern life. Things like refrigeration and climate control,
Yeah.
electronics, automotive. And Asia Pacific is really the region to watch. They're the largest market right now, and they're expected to grow the fastest in the coming years.
And even though there are some challenges like the high cost of production and the need to find more sustainable alternatives, the demand from key sectors like electric vehicles and advanced electronics is really pushing this market forward. So for our listeners out there, understanding these market dynamics is really important because it gives you a glimpse into the forces that are shaping the technologies and industries that we all rely on. From something as basic as keeping our food cold to the latest advances in transportation and communication, fluorochemicals are playing a crucial role.
Absolutely.
And as this market continues to evolve, one thing to really think about is the role of sustainable chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
How can we develop new fluorochemicals that are both high-performing and environmentally friendly? That's going to be a key challenge and a key opportunity in the years to come.
Yeah, for sure. It's something to watch closely.
All right, well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
See you later.